CNR Station Platform, small grain town on the Saskatchewan Main Line, November 1947, 20 minutes past 11 at night. Constable W.H. Oberg, RCMP, 7 years at this detachment, had arrived before the eastbound number 2 and taken his position at the far end of the platform, near the baggage shed, not near the passenger door. He was not watching the arriving passengers. He was watching the freight staging area at the east end of the platform, where 3 men he had not seen before were standing without luggage and without any visible purpose for being on the platform at all. The station master, whose office window overlooked the platform, had caught Oberg's eye as the train was slowing. One nod, brief, from across the glass. Oberg had been at this posting long enough to know what that nod meant and what it did not mean. Not an emergency, a flag, something that needed attention before it needed a response. The 3 men had come off a slow westbound freight earlier in the evening, he was almost certain. They had walked around to the passenger platform with the kind of deliberate casualness that Oberg had learned to read over 7 winters at this station. They were not traveling in any conventional sense. They were working the platform, split across it, watching the passengers descend, not watching the train. The elderly couple from the Pullman with the heavy case. The farm family from 3 cars back transferring with 2 children, and a trunk too large to watch from both sides at once. 7 years had given Oberg 3 pieces of information that no CP police occurrence book in Regina and no RCMP district office had ever been asked to contain. What were they? And what had 7 years at this one station built in him that made a station master's single nod from across a lit window worth as much as a written report? Before you can understand what 7 years at this posting had built in Constable Oberg, you need to understand what the institutional framework at a prairie railway station in 1947 actually was, and where its gaps fell. The CP police had existed since 1881, dissolved and reconstituted, eventually becoming the Department of Investigation in 1913, and by the 1940s a functioning railway police service with special constable authority and jurisdiction on CP property across Canada, the platform, the freight sheds, the right-of-way. The CN Police, formed with the CNR itself in the early 1920s, operated under the same legal framework. In a city like Winnipeg or Regina, a railway police constable might be present at every major arrival. In a grain town of 600 people on the Saskatchewan Main Line, the nearest CP police officer was 140 miles west in the division office. The platform was, in practice, one RCMP constable from the detachment 3 blocks away, arriving when the schedule required it and when no other call had come in at the same time. What the system provided at a small prairie station in 1947, the train schedule, the freight manifest filed with the railway, the RCMP occurrence book with previous incidents, and whatever the station master chose to communicate before the train arrived. No 2-way radio in the patrol car at smaller prairie detachments yet. The car that brought Oberg to the platform had no means of reaching the detachment until it returned. The patrol car was a 1947 or 1948 North American sedan, Ford or comparable, adapted for Prairie Division use. A heater that worked in October and stopped being reliable in January. No radio, no camera, a flashlight, the occurrence book, and whatever the constable carried in his knowledge of this specific station, this specific town, and the specific schedule he had been watching since 1940. What the station master's nod gave Oberg in 30 seconds was more operationally useful than anything the occurrence book had recorded about this platform in 6 months. That asymmetry between the institutional record and the knowledge of the officer who had been watching the same platform receive the same trains for 7 years is the subject. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who watched the same platform in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant. Not RCMP mythology, the documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose railway network required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized record was ever asked to know it. What the railway timetable never showed was what 7 years of watching the same platform build in an officer who knew every freight schedule, every station master's flag, and which end of the platform a wet November night made dangerous before the passenger car door had opened. And if you worked railway station patrol, RCMP, CN Police, CP Police, or your family did, put it in the comments. What did the officer who knew that station know that the train schedule never said? Coming up on this channel, the RCMP at the Winnipeg CNR immigration shed in 1948, what the arrivals document contained about a family, and what the officer who had already processed 200 families knew the document did not. Back on the platform, the first piece of information Oberg had that no occurrence book contained, the westbound freight that had run through that afternoon left Saskatoon at 2:10 p.m. and covered the run in 4 hours and 20 minutes in good weather, arriving at this station between 6:30 and 7 p.m. Any man who had come off that freight at this town and was still on the platform at 11:20 p.m. had spent 5 hours somewhere in town, the hotel, the cafe, the street. He was not waiting for a connection. He was waiting for the number 2, and the number 2 was a passenger train. The second piece, the platform on the east side of the freight shed had a blind spot from the station window during the passenger unloading. The station master could not see it from his position. Oberg had learned this in his second winter at this posting from an incident involving a stolen case that had happened in that corner, and he had never forgotten which section of which platform the station window could not reach. The third piece was not from any single incident, but from the accumulation of 7 years of attending the same station in the same seasonal cycles. He had learned what the specific population looked like that worked the prairie stations between Saskatoon and Winnipeg, and he had learned which circumstances consistently preceded their appearance at this particular station in late autumn. Post-war, the volume had increased. More men were in motion. Some were veterans. Some were harvest workers who had followed the crop east and run out of season. Some were something else entirely, and the officer who had been watching this platform since 1940 had learned the specific signals that separated one from another. Signals that no occurrence book entry, once closed, had been designed to preserve. None of these 3 pieces was in any institutional record. All 3 had been built from 7 years of watching the same platform in the same seasonal cycles. Winter arrivals, harvest workers in the fall, the immigration families in spring, until the pattern was in him the way the freight timetable was in the station master. Not memorized, known. What had it taken to build this? The same thing the station master had needed to build his equivalent knowledge of this station. Time. Repetition. The specific attentiveness of a person who understood that what they were watching was not routine, but a system with regularities, and that anomalies in that system were only visible to someone who knew the regular well enough to recognize the departure. A prairie railway station in 1947 was not one kind of place. It was a different place in January than in April. It was different at 11:20 p.m. for the number 2 than at 6:45 a.m. for the westbound local. The officer who had been at this posting since 1940 did not need a briefing to understand what the number 2 on a Wednesday night in November was likely to carry. He had watched it arrive 60 or 70 times. He knew what the passenger manifest looked like by the time the train came to a stop, before anyone had descended. The regular passengers. He knew them. Not the through passengers to Winnipeg who never left the car, but the weekly travelers, the commercial men on the grain circuit between Regina and the city, the farm family that came in on the last Wednesday of every month to settle accounts at the implement dealer. He knew which faces on the platform were the routine faces and which were new, and he knew what category of new face was likely at 11:20 p.m. on a Wednesday night in November. What the passenger knowledge gave him operationally, the ability to read the platform before it presented a problem. The elderly couple in the Pullman, he had seen that couple, or if not them, passengers of that precise type, and he knew what they looked like in the first 60 seconds on the platform, orienting to an unfamiliar station, the case not yet properly in hand, attention divided between finding the exit and managing the luggage. The farm family transferring was the same vulnerability, compounded by children. Both were visible from 40 feet, as the specific kind of fractured attention that 3 men positioned across a platform would act on before Oberg had covered the distance from where he was standing. The institutional record told him what had happened at this platform. The knowledge built from 7 years of watching what happened told him what was about to. Between those two things lay the operational gap that 7 years of watching the same platform in the same seasons had built in him, and that no occurrence book had ever been designed to contain. The freight side of a prairie station in 1947 was a different operational environment from the passenger platform, less visible from the station window, less regulated by the passenger timetable. It was where the work of the station happened. Baggage loaded and unloaded, freight manifests checked against the car, express parcels sorted and signed for. It was also where the men who had arrived without tickets spent the hours when they were not visible on the passenger side. Riding freight cars across the prairie had not ended with the Depression. By 1947, it was less common but not uncommon. Seasonal workers following the harvest east, men in transit between cities who had the knowledge and the practical willingness to travel that way, a few who had no other option. The experienced RCMP constable at a prairie station in 1947 had a working knowledge of which freight cars on which routes could be ridden, which stops on the main line were practical for getting off without being seen by the station agent, and what the freight schedule meant in terms of who had come off which car at what time. This knowledge had not come from any RCMP manual on vagrancy enforcement. It had come from 7 years of being wrong about it early, and then right about it later. He knew the baggage handlers. He knew the express clerk. He knew who worked the freight area on a Wednesday night, and what variations in their behavior meant. The station master's nod had included this, not stated, not specific, but included in what the nod meant. Oberg knew what the nod was pointing at. The only remaining question was whether it was pointing at the east end of the passenger platform, at the freight shed, or at both, and whether the 3 men he had identified were working one location or using the other as a fallback. The freight side of the station was not in the occurrence book in the way the passenger side was. It was in the officer who had spent 7 years learning both faces of this place. A prairie railway station in 1947 was not only a transit point. It was the physical location where the community met the world outside, and the world outside met the community. It was where the mail came in, where the newspaper arrived from the city the day after it was printed, where the implement parts ordered 3 weeks ago came off the express car. It was where the family put their son on the train in September 1939, and where they stood on the same platform 8 years later, waiting for the car he was coming back on, or the notification had come through the station master's office that he was not. The constable who had been at this posting since 1940 had been present at most of those arrivals. He had seen families waiting on the platform for a return that did not happen. The telegram notification had usually come through the station, and the constable had sometimes been there for those as well. He had seen the immigration families come off the train in 1947 with their documents and their cases and their careful, watchful posture in a place they had never been before. He knew, from watching 2 years of spring immigration arrivals, what a newly arrived family needed in the first 60 seconds on this platform and what they did not need from a uniformed officer in those 60 seconds. What he knew about the community that used this station was the community knowledge version of the road knowledge Corporal Henderson had about the grid roads north of Portage la Prairie. It was not in any RCMP assessment or social file. It was in him because he had been present for 7 years of arrivals and departures. He knew which families in the district had someone coming back that season and which had someone going. He knew the grain elevator agent who came to the station express window every Monday morning. This was the third layer of the station posting. Not the platform geometry, not the freight schedule, but the human fabric of the community this station served, and what the officer who had been watching it for 7 years understood about it that no institutional record had ever been designed to contain. Before you can fully understand what the prairie station posting was, you need to understand what it was within. The RCMP constable who had been at this detachment since 1940 was not only the officer who read the platform. He was the officer who, in the same posting, enforced the Federal Vagrancy Act against the men he had also learned to recognize by type, origin, and movement pattern. He was the officer who cooperated with federal immigration officers when the spring arrivals required documentation and processing that sometimes meant families waiting in the station waiting room while papers were reviewed. He was operating within the same institutional framework that, documented in the RCMP Heritage Center's own published history, had enforced the pass system, requiring First Nations to obtain written permission from an Indian agent to leave their reserve, from 1885 into the 1940s, and within the same force that, from the 1920 amendment of the Indian Act onward, had served as truant officers for the residential school system, returning children who had run from the schools and arresting parents who refused to surrender them. The officer who had built 7 years of station knowledge, who knew the freight schedule, the blind spot on the platform, the immigration arrival patterns, was the same officer operating within this institutional framework. These are not separate subjects. They are the same posting, in the same detachment, in the same years, in the same prairie towns where trains stopped, and where the RCMP was the operational face of policies that would later be understood as producing profound and documented harm. This channel documents the full picture, the genuine operational knowledge that 7 years at one station built, and the full institutional context within which that knowledge was exercised. The knowledge is worth documenting. The context is part of what the knowledge actually was. By the mid-1960s, the operational model that had produced Oberg's platform knowledge was ending. The RCMP began consolidating rural prairie detachments into larger district operations. The single officer posting in a railway corridor town, the detachment 3 blocks from the station, the constable who arrived before every number 2, became a district patrol car covering 3 towns from a central location. Two-way radio was now reliable in most prairie postings. An officer could be reached and redirected anywhere in the district at any time. The operational rationale for the long rural posting, the depth of local knowledge it produced, was replaced by the operational rationale of flexible deployment. What consolidation gave the RCMP? Coverage efficiency, flexible response, the ability to reach any point in the district within 30 minutes. What it removed from the railway towns? The officer who had been watching the same platform for 7 years. The officer who arrived at the Consolidated District Post in 1968 had been there 14 months. He knew the stations on the district circuit from the route sheet. He knew which trains ran on which days from the railway timetable. He knew the occurrence book entries for the previous calendar year. He did not know the westbound freight arrival time from Saskatoon and what it meant if a man who had been on it was still on the passenger platform at 11:20 p.m. He had not been wrong about the blind spot behind the freight shed and then right about it for 6 subsequent years. He had not been present for the station master's first 2 winters at this posting and built the specific working rapport that made a nod from across a lit window into an operational communication worth reading correctly. He could be reached by radio. He could cover twice the territory. What he knew about any one station on his circuit was a fraction of what Oberg had known about this one. That asymmetry between coverage and depth, between the reach of a district patrol car and the knowledge of an officer who had stood at the same platform in November 7 times, is not mentioned in any consolidation report from the 1960s. The knowledge that Oberg had was not documented before he transferred out. It was never understood as the kind of thing that could be documented. It was not in any file. It was in him. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more platforms, more detachments, more freight schedules that no occurrence book contained, more station master nods that took 7 years to learn to read correctly, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What the railway timetable never showed was what 7 years of watching the same platform build in an officer who knew every freight schedule, every station master's flag, and which end of the platform a wet November night made dangerous before the passenger car door had opened. That knowledge is somewhere else now, and if you worked railway station patrol, RCMP, CN Police, CP Police, or your family did, put it in the comments. What did the officer who knew that station know that the train schedule never said? Coming up on this channel, the RCMP at the Winnipeg CNR immigration shed in 1948, what the arrivals document contained about a family, and what the officer who had already processed 200 families knew the document did not. Constable Oberg transferred out of this detachment in 1955. The posting was absorbed into a district operation in 1967. What consolidation gave the RCMP? Flexible deployment, lower cost, a district car that covered 3 times the station territory. What it did not give the railway platform at this grain town on the Saskatchewan main line. An officer who knew which end of the freight shed had a blind spot from the station window. The patrol car that came through in November 1968 knew the route from the timetable. It covered the station on schedule. It did not know the 5-hour gap in the westbound freight arrival, or what a man still on the passenger platform at 11:20 p.m. had spent those 5 hours doing. Oberg had known both. He had learned them from 7 years, and from being wrong once in his second winter, and right about it every time after. Nobody had asked what they were before he transferred out. The platform still has the same blind spot. The freight schedule still produces the same gap. The knowledge is somewhere else now.